Hi, this is Martin Fowler, and you're listening to the Agile Uprising.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Agile Uprising podcast. I am your host, Troy Lightfoot, and with me I have my co-host, Chris Murman. Hello, Chris.
Hello.
Nice to see you again. And we have a very special guest, someone that's been with the Agile Uprising for a long, long time, pretty much since the beginning. I don't know exactly.
She's really old.
Right. We used to call her, it's funny, actually. We used to have a name for you, like a silly name called the Queen of Kanban. And then years later, you became the CEO of ProKanban.org. So it seems like we were prophets. We were totally prophetic about that. So anyway, welcome Colleen Johnson, who is the CEO of ProKanban.org. Welcome, Colleen.
Thanks, Troy. Happy to be here. Yeah, I don't really want to consider myself like a queen of Kanban. Maybe I'm like I don't know. We're trying to distribute this knowledge around, right?
Well, to be fair, you never gave yourself that title. That was that we gave you. So
just tell us to stop calling her that, though. To be fair,
okay. Well, it's a friendly title, So anyway, yes. So Colleen, do you want to give just a real brief intro about yourself, so then we'll get started?
Yeah, that sounds great. Okay. So I am the CEO of ProKanban.org, and I'm an Agile coach with Agile Velocity. I've worn a lot of different hats as an entrepreneur and founder of Scatterspoke, an online tool for retrospectives and dev team metrics and insights. And in that, got an opportunity to play the product role. More specifically, we do a lot of coaching of how products should look, but that really gave me a chance to wear that product hat myself. And you know what? It's really fucking hard. It's hard to, all the things we expect everyone to go do in that product role, they're hard when it's your own product. And so I really enjoyed being in that seat and having an opportunity to do all the things that we coach to, right, around getting feedback from customers, folding it into your product. But all the things that organizations struggle with, and having releases with too much in them, and trying to add scope at the last minute or add too many things to a feature. So it's been a fun journey of being in a coaching and training seat, but also being in the front seat to those roles that we're often coaching.
Cool. Well, thank you for the intro. I'll say one thing I remembered. So just full transparency. So I trained for ProKanban.org. So Colleen and I, we've known each other for a long time, but we have a working relationship that way too. And I recently did a study group with a few of my students, actually, where we did a deep dive on CFDs. And I taught them how to draw CFDs by hand. And what's funny is maybe 8 years ago, I feel like it's close to that now. I worked with you, Colleen, where you taught a class, and you taught me actually how to draw CFDs by hand on paper and do that by hand, because I had only used them in a tool. And I realized that once you do it by hand, you actually understand it much more in depth and how to use the tool. So I always teach people how to do it by hand, even digitally now. So wanted to thank you for that, Colleen, because I still use that technique to this day teaching.
I'm actually headed back to New York next week. I think that's where we were when we
yeah, exactly. So
it's funny, and I think every time I tell everybody, you'll never have to create a CFD chart by hand. Don't worry. And here you are.
Right. Yes. It's kind of like the Monte Carlo. Like once you learn how to do it by hand, that it starts to all make sense, kind of thing, right?
Really does.
So, right.
It's probably why I don't understand CFDs as well as you do, Troy.
Very good. Well, hey, let's do it by hand sometime. Maybe we can write another podcast where we go through that. So, okay. So, Colleen, I saw a talk yesterday. You were at the Product Owner Summit with some other big name players in the industry, like Roman Pickler and Vasco Doherty. I think that's how you say his last name. And a bunch of other great folks. And you did a talk on the death of product roadmaps or product roadmap. And, it's kind of a clickbait title, right? But that's what it takes in this world to get anybody to look at your videos and podcasts anymore. So I'm going to have probably a clickbait title for this episode, by the way. So, and I just found it very interesting and apropos for, what I've been doing in my career. And so I wanted to ask you, first question I had is the death of the product roadmap. Why do they need to die, or are they dead already? I'm guessing they're not dead, but the talk is really more about why they should die.
Or were they ever alive to begin with?
Right. So, right. So if you could just go through, what do you mean by that? And if you could go over reasons, what is the case for why they would need to die?
Yeah, I wish they were dead. They're not dead.
Okay.
In the talk, and the talk is still available on YouTube, I think I don't think you have to register or anything to get to that link, but and we could put it in the show notes, but I really boiled it down to three things that I think are what's busted about not just the product roadmap itself as an artifact, but the process of getting to a product roadmap. And there's three things, right? It's speculative, it's deterministic, and it's prescriptive. And it's speculative from the very get-go, right? Trying to decide right now what we're going to deliver a year from now is ridiculous. Right. I think it's just such a crazy practice when we put it that way, that we're going to decide all the things that we should be working on a year from now. And if COVID taught us nothing, it should be that everything can change in the blink of an eye. And that doesn't really make sense, right? It doesn't make sense for us to try to be picking all of the features that every team is going to deliver a year from now.
Right.
And then the other piece of the what we're going to deliver is when, and that's where the deterministic piece comes in. And it's a big part of, this move towards more probabilistic forecasting is that there's a lot of different outcomes that are possible. When we say deterministic, it means that only one outcome is possible. And that means that we're going to start on this exact date and we're going to stop on this exact date, which is also almost always wrong. Right. And as soon as one thing on that Gantt chart's wrong, everything after it's wrong. So we're locking ourselves into something that's just not realistic from a delivery standpoint either. And then the prescriptive part comes in order to get all of those perfectly accurate start and stop times on our Gantt chart. We need to do a bunch of estimating, right? And pointing and trying to figure out all of the work required to deliver those features. And so we start to get really prescriptive in order to do that, which means we need to know how we're going to execute or how we're going to deliver each of those features in order to come up with those time boxes. And so we spend all this time defining work that we're not going to touch for another 8 months or 12 months or whatever the case may be. And oftentimes we're not including the right people in those conversations or the people actually doing the work. And we're locking ourselves into when, what, and how we're going to deliver that stuff without having any of the actual feedback from the customers.
Right. Thanks, Colleen. I love it. Those three things you mentioned: speculative, deterministic, and prescriptive. So maybe I can just talk for a second about deterministic versus probabilistic thinking and why that's important for something like a product roadmap, right? So, as you mentioned, deterministic thinking is really assuming that there's only one possible outcome to something, right? So, this is what the scope is going to be, this is what the timeline is going to be, and that is the outcome that's going to happen. That is deterministic. Probabilistic thinking is basically just recognizing that, hey, maybe there's more than one possible thing that could happen during this time period. If there's more than one possible thing, then using a deterministic approach is less than ideal, put it that way. So that's a little bit of the differences. One is just realizing, hey, maybe there's more than one possible thing. So therefore, in order to try to predict the future exactly, is a problem. Troy,
can I ask one quick follow-up before you move on? I apologize. Sure. So, and actually, this is for you too, Troy. So, all right. So, Colleen, everything you said, they make perfect sense in this wonderful echo chamber that we have. And yet, time after time, leader after leader, we talk to them and they think and say the opposite.
Yeah.
Why? Why?
Colleen, since you're the guest, I'll leave it to you first.
Yeah.
Why?
Why do they need it, or why?
No, why do they, like, everything you said makes sense. Like, why is it that leaders continually see the opposite as the truth that they see?
A lot of times I think it's our funding models, right? So our funding models are still often very project based, where we have to fund by the when, what, and how we're going to deliver the feature. And so I think that becomes a big part of it. But I think this is also kind of just an old school way of planning, right? And so it's giving organizations a sense of control that's just not there. And I think we all love, everybody wants to feel like they know what's going to happen next. And so we're trying to figure out that plan for the whole year. I think it's a culture shift for a lot of organizations to get comfortable with what Troy just said, that probabilistic way of thinking that maybe there's more than one possible outcome and we don't know what we're going to work on next. We're going to wait and get feedback to decide. That takes retraining a lot of the way that businesses work. And it's not going to happen all at once, right? You have to kind of find the pockets of leaders that are willing to try to shift their thinking to that more exploratory kind of mindset.
Okay. Thanks for that, Colleen. So that leads me into my next question. As you mentioned about portfolio Kanban systems versus a product roadmap in your talk. And maybe first of all, can you explain what you mean by that, like difference between the two and how they're different?
Yeah. So, a roadmap, as we said, is typically defined what we're going to work on and when we're going to work on it, when it's going to be delivered, and everything required to deliver that feature. When we talk about a portfolio Kanban system, we're really looking at all of the work and every different stage of that workflow from idea to delivery. And this is important because for a lot of organizations, we spend all of our time and energy managing the stuff that's actively being developed and not a lot of time looking upstream to figure out what ideas are on the table, how do we validate those ideas, how do we decide what to pull next. All of that also requires time, energy, and attention around how we manage that flow of work into our teams. So when we think about a portfolio Kanban system, it's creating visibility into all those different stages of work, and it's also managing the work in the workflow. And so what becomes important here is looking at capacity across the organization and trying to figure out how many things do we need to have ready for teams to pull, and then giving them the opportunity to pick what they're going to work on next, or have the organization pick what they're going to work on next when they have capacity to do so. So instead of jamming all this work up and assuming this is all the right stuff for us to pull next, we're picking what we're going to work on when we have when something moves to done, essentially, when that capacity opens up.
Awesome. So one way that people tend to figure out their capacity is using story points and historical velocity, right? That's one way, a pretty common way. Is there a different way you would recommend for this type of system?
Yeah. So there's a couple pieces when we talk about capacity at this level that we want to think about. We're looking, typically at this level more at throughput of features, and it can be epic level as well. So we want to look at the throughput of work items in the past. How many features are we getting done in a certain period of time, or how many, this can be story level, feature level, epic level, depending on how your organization breaks down their work. But we're going to look more at historical throughput and historical cycle time. And this is important because it's inclusive of all that stuff that's hard to account for, right? When we're story pointing or when we're estimating future work, we're often thinking about our piece, right? How long will it take me to develop this feature? And it's not that people are trying to give us shitty estimates, right? They're not trying to sandbag. They're just thinking about, here's my part. Here's how long that part will take me. But we're not thinking about how long it sits waiting to be tested or packaged or deployed. And all those other activities that turn our 3-day estimate into 2 weeks. And so when we use that historical throughput and cycle time, we get all of that baked in already. But when we think about how that capacity gets managed in that portfolio, we start to do that through work in progress limits. And my colleague at Pro Kanban, Pratik Singh, has this amazing article on Medium. I'll find it for the show notes as well. Where he refers to WIP limits as an optimal operating capacity. And I think that's such a cool way to think about your WIP limits, right? Because that's really what you're doing with a WIP limit or work in progress limit, is to say, this is our optimal operating capacity for this stage of our workflow, whether that's product definition, design, develop, whatever your stages may look like. But we're starting to use those work in progress limits to say, we can't handle more work than this without it sitting idle.
Yeah, I really struggle getting leaders to see that. I guess from both of your perspective, is it easier when you're dealing with that work at a portfolio level as opposed to, like, say, a Kanban board at a team level? Is it easier or harder to get leaders to see WIP limits at that portfolio level?
In my experience, I think it's a little bit easier. in certain pockets, right? So what often happens at the portfolio level is we set all the WIP limits based off the number of engineering teams or engineering arts, right? Or whatever, however you want to look at that. But we start there and we tend to ignore all the stuff upstream. So like a common pattern I see is where we'll say, this is, at the portfolio level, this is how many value streams, arts, whatever your structure is, that we have delivering, but we don't think about, well, we only have 2 product managers that are doing all of the validation of all of the work that has to feed 20 development teams. That's not balanced, right? So we either need more capacity, we need more people upstream to help balance that out, or we need less work in progress for the development teams where maybe they're swarming on a couple epics or features at the same time. Troy, have you seen anything different around that?
No, what you said is totally correct. A lot of people focus on throughput and limiting WIP on the board itself for the purposes of throughput. But one of the biggest lessons that I've learned over the years is that you should really think about limiting your WIP on the input of your process, right? Because that's going to help you with your flow. So controlling the WIP on the queue coming up next, that kind of up next kind of style of working, that will help you eventually with your be able to achieve your flow, and that will help you with your throughput. And so you can try to match your throughput somewhat, right, with the amount of input. So you can kind of look at your throughput and think about, okay, if we're getting as a portfolio, 10 features done per quarter or something like that, or whatever you're putting in your portfolio Kanban board, then how many things should we be bringing onto our board? Should it be 30, right? Should it be 20? Should it be 10? Should you just have those conversations? And then that's one way of controlling the WIP too.
Yeah, it's a great point. And controlling that WIP at the front end of your process also helps exactly with what we're talking about here, of that not over planning, right? You're planning just in time. You're keeping the amount of next things to pull really small. And I think that, it's interesting in some of the simulations we do in Kanban classes, and same, with you, Troy, like one of the things that I think is always interesting when we ask the students, what happens when you reduce the number of things that are available for the team to pull? One of the comments I hear most often is, it's quicker to decide, right? Because if I only have 2 things to pick from instead of 200 things in a backlog, I know it's one of those 2 things that's the next highest priority. And that decision fatigue at a portfolio level is expensive, right? Think about all the people involved in making these decisions around what we're going to pull next. So if we can apply that thinking of shrinking the options down to just a few things around and limiting the amount of options that are available, we're also making it a lot easier to make a decision on what we want to work on next.
Awesome. One question I had that you mentioned in your talk, which is a pretty popular framework, not just in software development, but in any kind of portfolio management, which you kind of bring into your talk, which is the 3 horizons approach. This approach comes from McKinsey. I think they documented it first in the 90s, actually. Yeah. And it's in other frameworks, like SAFe, for example, has part of their LPM process and things like that. And I think it's really valuable, by the way. SAFe, like regardless of the framework, that technique is pretty powerful. So how do you see the 3 horizons falling into, or what is the relationship between the 3 horizons approach and with your portfolio Kanban system? How do you see those 2 things, Mary?
Yeah. So I think when I, in the talk and when I teach about portfolio Kanban, I tend to think of the horizons more as investment strategy than as time horizons. And so it's a slightly different approach. I think for a lot of organizations, they use the term horizon to mean what's closer and what's further out in the roadmap, right? Right. If we're busting up those time boxes and we think of horizons more around investments, the McKinsey article that you're referencing talks about Horizon 1 being what are the things that our customers expect us to have, their table stakes features. Horizon 2, or what are the things that we're going to introduce to steal our competitors' customers, right? And then 3 are what are the crazy new ideas that are going to help us really innovate in the space that we're in? What are the things that no one's asking for yet? And I like that model because every organization is probably going to have a different investment strategy and what those things need to look at depending on where they are in their journey. But understanding that is going to help you understand and help you figure out how many things you need to have that you're running experiments on, right? So Horizon 3 things are probably very heavy in the experimentation model where you need to go out and throw a lot of spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. Horizon 1 features are probably not going to require a lot of investment upstream in that discovery cycle, because you know what your customers need to have to be able to do the things that they need to do on your technology, right? So I think the first part of that from a portfolio perspective is, what are our investments? What do we want that to look like? And then how do we use that understanding of the breakdown of our investments to help us figure out how much discovery we need upstream?
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. Go ahead.
Sorry, Troy. Go ahead. Oh no, I've always tried to use the budget kind of scenario it's as a different way of describing what you did, Colleen. The challenge that I have, especially with the portfolio Kanban, is like operational type work, that Horizon 1 type of like. So I had my recent client described it as like always on, or like support style work. It's got a different funding model than capitalizable work. Also, it completely screws with your WIP limits, because if you've got, whether it's an epic or a feature or whatever, you've got this bucket of operational support work that really it almost lives to mess with the board and limits that you have. So when clients throw those at you two, like what's the easiest way to kind of compartmentalize that work without breaking the whole thing?
Yeah, I guess I'll take a swing at it. And Troy, I'm curious to hear your response too. But
Sure.
Work is work. And so it's like, it doesn't matter if I'm baking a cake or vacuuming the floor. I might have to vacuum every couple of days because I've got 3 kids and a dog, but the cake is more exciting. Maybe I'm going to make money off that cake. I don't know. But if you think about it, it's all just still work. It all is using up your team's capacity, attention, time, and available resources, right? And so if we look at it from that perspective, it uses WIP the same way, that operating capacity the same way, and needs to be represented that way on your board. So I think to me, it's being able to visualize that breakdown of what's our ideal investment strategy look like, so that if your organization says, we want 20% of our work to be keep the lights on, and 70% to be Horizon 2 steal customers, and 10% to be Horizon 3. If you can color code that or visualize that on your product board, that's going to help you figure out what to pull next. So if you have 10 epics in flight and half your board is keep the lights on work, you know that, hey, we need to balance out our portfolio a little bit here. The next thing we pull in should be something that's in Horizon 2 or 3. So I think the first step is, what's our ideal investment? And then how do you visualize that and leverage that information to help you figure out what to pull next?
Great answer, Colleen. I would like to add to that answer, because everything you said, and one way of doing it is, a lot of times the operational type work might not be as large as a lot of the other type of initiatives that might be on a portfolio Kanban board. Now, some of them might be, and if that case, then they go on the board with everything else. But if it's just maintenance, small improvements, things like that, you could just have the teams or team of teams construct set their own individual capacity. For example, like, hey, this doesn't have to come through the portfolio system. You just pull it when you have capacity, right? And then they also know what's on the Kanban board. You're giving them options, and they can pull those things when they have capacity. So it's essentially managing their own capacity. So they might say, hey, 15% of our capacity is going to go towards work that's not even going to the portfolio level. I'm using it as an example, right? Operational maintenance, enhancements. The people at the portfolio level, they don't even have to worry about these stuff. It's like run the business work. And that just gets pulled through their own capacity. And then they pull things off the portfolio Kanban board. So it could be a mix of both, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I like that. And I think, what's important when we start to think about how these Kanban boards nest up kind of into these different levels, is having this structure at the portfolio level starts to trickle down, right? And what I see for a lot of organizations, whether it's Scrum or Kanban at the team level, we're so focused on the efficiency of the process, right? Is everybody busy? Are we cranking out? Or, is our velocity improving? But we start to get disconnected from the work at this portfolio level. So our velocity might look great, and everybody's, we're following Scrum by the book or Kanban by the book at the team level, but is it the right work? Like, are we delivering the right things? Are we making progress on those big rocks, and getting those things done? And I think that's where the power in the portfolio Kanban really comes together. It starts to bring all of the team's focus to the things that the organization decides matter the most.
Right. Thanks, Carly. I wanted to add something because in your talk, I took a note actually, and it reminded me a little bit of when people say, hey, this thing is agile. So many people equate Scrum with agile. It's like, I don't know, but I don't know why that is, but I guess it's like people calling a soda a Coke, even though not all soda is Coke, right? Kind of thing. A lot of people like Pepsi, you know. So, and I like Diet Pepsi or Pepsi Zero, I should say. So anyway, but I don't call it a Coke for sure. So the first principle. So you talked, Colleen, about doing all of the agile practices. You could be the best at the practices of agile, right? But that doesn't mean you're actually going to be getting any kind of business results if you're not delivering the right thing, right? So the practices of Agile should really be there to and help enhance the ability to learn if we're building the right things, right? And so you made a comment about in your talk, and I took a note, I'm going to read it. It says, think about a product portfolio as a set of bets that you incrementally invest more into, AKA assign capacity to. So it's basically, how can we create a series of small, quote unquote, bets at a portfolio level, right? And that you assign, and people that have the capacity will pull those bets once it's in the queue, right? And you prioritize that based on those horizons approach, right? Based on your strategy. And I love that because then it makes sense where if we have really efficient and effective agile practices, we can actually see the results of those bets much faster with good quality. Because, like, for example, our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery, right? That's kind of that first principle of Agile. And so that marries very well with the concept of placing small bets that allows us to do this early and continuous delivery. So that is how it all feeds together. Scrum or not is what I'm saying. So it's really regardless of the process. So it makes a lot of sense to me. I don't know, Chris, do you have any thoughts about that?
No, I don't have anything additional to add. It's
Okay.
kind of hard when you say all the genius stuff in one.
Oh, come on now. I read a post on LinkedIn that said agile processes were, this is a side note, but it just reminded me of this. Agile processes were designed by engineers. Therefore, we don't live in an engineer world. We live in a product world. Therefore, the agile processes aren't good. Like, I'm like, what? Doesn't even make any sense. What you're just describing makes zero sense. But anyway, sorry, because if you have to marry the two things together, right? They were designed for learning fast, iterative development, learning about your customers, learning what's working, what isn't. That's the reason why we're designed in the first place. Anyway, I digress. I did have one question for you, Colleen. This might be like a devil's advocate type of question, but I would imagine you might get this type of question if you work with leadership or senior leader. That question is, okay, well and good, right? We have a portfolio Kanban, we do horizons, we break them down into smaller chunks. Okay. What about if I'm planning a product at scale, which is a product of products, right? So for example, I'm trying to build a new iPhone, right? I have a bunch of software, firmware, hardware, other apps that are involved in that have to be ready in order to launch an iPhone. If I don't have a visual product roadmap of the next 3 to 5 years, how the hell am I going to coordinate all of these teams and areas of the company? That is a question you might get, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's you still can have a roadmap, right? We still have a list of things that have to get done, of options that are in our backlog, right? But what's going to be interesting here, and hardware is a great example of this. And right now, our world climate is a great example of this. What happens if there's a shortage of one of the parts that you need to be able to do the next thing in your roadmap, right? So having, what we're talking about here is flexibility on what you work on next. And so being able to respond to what's happening in your supply chain, what's happening. Hey, we just laid off half of our company, half of our technology team, right? So now we're going to pivot and we're going to pull this other thing that maybe is a pared down version of what we originally thought we were going to build next. So it's really about the flexibility to respond to what's going on and pull based on those events, based on what is available to you in the moment, that this is all about. So it's, you can still have an idea of what things need to be true to launch your new phone, right? But it's about the flexibility of the order that we're doing them in and the responsiveness of what's going on in your climate, your market, your organization, so that you, and from your customers, right? If our goal, like you said, our small bets is to learn as quickly as possible, how can you get something in front of customers or a test market of customers as quickly as possible to make sure that you're on the right track and respond that feedback.
That makes sense. This is what I was thinking, Kelly, when I listened to your talk, is that there's nothing inherently wrong with having a roadmap. This is my thought. It's more about how those roadmaps are developed and used that makes them the problem, right? Like if you want to use it as a way of sketching out things that might have to happen over a timeline logically to do something, right? If that's like an exercise that's helping you do that and you want to communicate that with people, then it makes sense, right? But as soon as you use it to say, this is exactly when every single thing is going to be delivered, or if you don't just say that, but someone sees that and that's what they interpret in their head, that's often what happens. That's when it becomes a problem, right? So it's really about marrying what you said about the portfolio Kanban system with how can we do that, and if necessary, use a visual indicator of things over time that we might build, but not have people interpret it as a deterministic approach.
Yeah.
Have you found any success with using those two things together?
It's almost, Troy, like you said, that it's not the tool or the framework, it's the problem. It's the humans that use it.
Yes.
I feel like I just said what you said with less words.
I need, you know what? I need you all the time around me, Chris, to just re-say what I say. Are you kidding me?
I'm Captain Wordy. That's fine.
Yeah. Colleen, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about all of what we're trying to do from a lean perspective is about reducing the waste, right? Reducing waste in what we're doing. And I think if you boiled down what you just said and what we were talking about at the very beginning about what's not working around roadmaps, it's all the upfront waste, right? It's waste around what we have to do to get that roadmap pulled together. That's wasted effort, wasted time, and it's inaccurate usually at the end of the day. So it's shifting our thinking. You can still think through what are all the pieces that need to come together to deliver something, and it can all be Horizon 1 or it can be very hardware driven, but it's creating a system that's flexible in how we approach that work and can respond to changes in our environment. So I think I think the way you said it is spot on.
Well, thank you. So one way I like to do that to kind of marry the two approaches is to put together a series of goals and a way of measuring those goals over time with the notion that this will likely change, right? And you can visualize that with some functionality that might have to go and then other things that are optional for that. But using a goal-based approach to a roadmap and relying less on specific timelines of individual features, right, is a way of marrying the flexibility with a just-in-time approach to prioritization. And there's ways to do that. I typically will, if I do help somebody create a visual roadmap, I will always put like what goals we're trying to achieve if they want to use a timeline and how we're going to measure those goals, what things we might need to get feedback on, and then caveat that with, this is what we're thinking now. Not only will it likely change, it's almost guaranteed to change. Just let people know that. We have thought through the best we know right now. We've thought through that, right? Like
roadmaps are just like plans. They make people feel comfortable. Oh, right. I know what you want transparency and openness with what we have going on. This is what we have planned. Like, please give us the same funding or more funding. We want to keep doing this. The problem is that if we could dedicate back to your building the next iPhone kind of a thing, a lot of those teams are dedicated to building only those things. Like they don't get support tickets. Right. They don't get the keep the lights on stuff. They are set aside and dedicated to putting those things. So you could say, all right, I'm going to create teams to be dedicated to doing this work. Here's the roadmap. Go build it. Mm-hmm. Problem is that funding changes, the economy changes, the organization changes. Like we reorg every 12 to 18 months. So if that's the case, like why are we building something permanent or semi-permanent when we know nothing else happens? I always tell leaders, like, why would you set up something to where it's you either deliver all of it or you deliver none of the value, right? So if you have a binary set of value, then you're not living in in the 2020s, like, because that's not how companies operate anymore.
Well, and I think what you said, Murman, always reminds me of like one of my biggest pet peeves in the product space is when I hear a product owner or product manager say they have to keep their teams busy. Like I have to go find work to keep my team busy. And I think we see that a lot because we have all these separate streams with separate roadmaps and separate sets of priorities that that at the end of the day become what you just described, right? I built this team that can only do iOS development. Now I have to keep a steady stream of work ready for them at all times. So now we have separate roadmaps designed to keep people busy instead of to align around that value at the portfolio level.
Well, yeah, because if you ask their team members, they would not say, no, don't go get us more work. We have plenty to do, right? So,
yeah, great point. Well, Colleen, anything, I think we're about at time. Anything you'd like to leave for a parting word? Anything you'd like to tell people to go check out? Up to you now, whatever you want.
Yeah, I think, what you were starting to describe there with what's the lightest weight thing that can move through our system really comes down to having clarity around your workflow policies. Mm-hmm. So what has to be true in each state for something, for an epic, for a feature to move from one stage to the next of our workflow. And for most of the organizations where I've had the opportunity to design a portfolio system that's truly theirs and that shows their workflow and their workflow policies. Organizations tend to use this as a way to kind of police everybody. It's like here's all the things that aren't happening that I'm going to require a checklist for, that so I can make sure we check every box before a feature gets into development. And I think, and circling back to the elimination of waste here and making this process as lightweight as possible so that we aren't wasting a bunch of upfront effort. We want to think about how do we make this as simple and as light as possible so things can move through, and that we are more comfortable saying, oh, we're not going to work on that. We're going to throw this away. And that starts with not spending 6 months trying to define it so we can get an estimate for a roadmap, right? So start lightweight. And focus on pulling work over planning. So having clarity around what your pull criteria looks like, having good options that can move through your workflow when you have the capacity to pull them.
Beautiful. I want to give one additional kind of a resource for people to add on to that. So, because maybe she's being humble and doesn't want to plug herself, I will plug her company. This is all free, what I'm about to mention, by the way. So there's nothing you have to buy for the next part. So Colleen is the CEO of ProKanban.org, and she works with folks like Pratik Singh and Dan Vicanti and a bunch of wonderful people over there at ProKanban.org. Anyway, there is a free resources section. So if you go to ProKanban.org, look at resources and kind of go down to where it says Scaling Portfolio Kanban Learning Resources, you will find a bunch of different articles, blog posts, books that you can read to help you get started with this approach, right? And it's all free, right? So I just want to throw that out there. There's no money for that. And that's a really fantastic way of going about it. If you happen to want to have like an instructor-led understanding of this stuff, ProKanban.org also has like official training classes and things like that. But in order to get started, you can literally just go to the resources section and start reading for free, and you don't have to pay a dime. So
that's right. For those of you that have listened to Troy on podcasts and at like 30-minute, 45-minute chunks and said, man, he sounds so smart. Like you could get to listen to him for an entire class.
You could sit there for days and listen to Troy.
I mean, all right. Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Listen, this sounds like I'm making fun of him. He's 10 times smarter than I am. Like you trust me, if you listen to him in a class, you will pick up so much stuff.
Well, I appreciate that, Chris, but I totally disagree with you. I think if you think about a bell curve, we're all probably similar in there, right? So that's okay. But anyway, so thank you for that. Oh, one more thing. There's a free Slack channel that you can join. It's totally free. You can go in there and ask any questions you want. And there's a bunch of trainers and people in the community that will talk to you. It's a ProKanban.org, a free Slack. So if you read the resources, you're like, I want to talk to some people about this, and you don't want to pay any money, you can go to the Slack channels as well. So all free. So it will be helpful. And of course, our own Agile Uprising Discord, of course, which is also free. So a couple of different resources for you there. Well, thanks, Chris. Thanks, Colleen. I had a good time. Hopefully people found this interesting or at a very minimally, hope people found it interesting, actually. So that's a minimum requirement for doing a podcast, I think. So anyway, so thank you very much, everybody.